Hi, and welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder. And today we are going to begin the talk about the Civil War and kind of the lead up through the 1850s through the Civil War. So let's go ahead and get started. Learning targets today, we'll talk about slavery in the territories with the Compromise of 1850, Fugitive Slave Act. We'll talk about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. We'll talk about the candidates for president in the election of 1860, and we'll analyze why the southern states secede from the Union. So, talking about the slavery in the territories, first off, we have the Wilmot Proviso. And a proviso is just kind of an add-on to a bill that's in the House or the Senate. And we're getting a lot of land from the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Texas session. So what will prevent slavery from being in those states? Northerners wonder. So David Wilmot, a northerner from Pennsylvania, decides that he wants to call for a ban on slavery in any territory that the U.S. gains from the Mexican-American War. This kind of divides the South versus the North because Southerners are outraged by this. Why wouldn't we be able to have slavery here? They should have slavery if they want to, etc. So it never becomes a law, but it does increase slavery tensions. Out of this, the Free Soil Party forms, and the Free Soil Party is a new political party, and their main agenda is preventing the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. And they even get so popular that they nominate former President Martin Van Buren for president again in 1848, but lose. California enters as a free state in the Compromise of 1850 after the 1849 gold rush. That's why they have the 49ers football team there, because in 1849, that's when the gold rush happens. People move to California in droves. California becomes a free state, and instead of balancing it with another slave state in the South, since one wasn't ready to enter, we make the Compromise of 1850. And in that, California is able to enter as a free state. Slavery issues from now on will be decided by popular sovereignty in the Western territories, which means that voters are going to decide the issue for themselves. And to appease the South, we pass a new, stricter Fugitive Slave Act, which means that slaves that are arrested for being a runaway slave, they're denied a jury trial, and it actually forces northern citizens to capture runaways. So if you see a runaway slave, you are required by law to capture him. And the North resists this. They don't want to make people do this against their will, so they pass personal liberty laws. And these basically nullify or make void the Fugitive Slave Act and arrest known slave catchers. And so think about this, like we have state laws now going against federal laws, and it's pretty much a bad situation leading up to we're going to have some sort of resolution. In 1852, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin is published, and Uncle Tom's Cabin was published by Harriet Beecher Stowe, a northerner, who writes it to condemn slavery. And Tom is the main character, and he puts a face to slavery that a lot of northerners didn't see before. And so they may have heard about slavery, they may know what it is, they don't know the horrors of it though. But this really lets northerners know the horrors of slavery in Uncle Tom's Cabin. It becomes the best-selling novel of the 1800s and the second best-selling book behind the Bible. And when Stowe visits the White House, President Lincoln meets her and says, "So you are the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." So Uncle Tom's Cabin, definitely in history a cause of the Civil War. In 1854, we have the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They're ready to enter as a free state. Of course, the Southerners don't like this, so again, we need to add another slave state. So we rewrite the bill to create Kansas and Nebraska, and we're going to let voters there decide the fate of the state by popular sovereignty to see if they want slavery in that bill. People move here. Like, people come to Nebraska, they commit voter fraud, they're all trying to outnumber the other. They each set up their own government, so we have a pro-slavery and anti-slavery government. Violence erupts between these two groups, and the situation becomes known as Bleeding Kansas. John Brown is an abolitionist, in the North, and he's an extreme abolitionist, and he murders 5 pro-slavery settlers with basically machetes and broadswords, and this violence is just out of control, and the fighting never stops really until the end of the Civil War. In 1861, Kansas does enter the Union as a free state. In the 1850s, the opposition to slavery was so strong by some people that they create the new Republican Party, and that would be the Republican Party that we have today. It quickly surpasses the former Whig Party, which was based on economics, as the main opposition to the Democrats, and they lose the election of 1856 to James Buchanan, but the Republican Party does take 11 northern states. And Buchanan really is sort of a weak leader. He doesn't take a strong stance on the slavery issue. He thinks it will sort itself out, and we'll talk about him a little later. During the 1850s, in the 1858 Senate race in Illinois, Stephen Douglas is running against a young up-and-coming politician named Abraham Lincoln, and they challenge each other to a series of debates. Douglas is pro-slavery. He's okay with it. He says, let the voters decide by popular sovereignty. Lincoln is anti-slavery, not necessarily anti-slavery in the South, but anti-slavery in the territories. And Douglas wins the Senate seat, but Lincoln gains the national attention needed for a presidential run in 1860. One more important thing is the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, or Scott versus Sanford, or the Dred Scott case. You'll hear it called a number of things. So Dred Scott is a slave in Missouri. For 10 years, he resides in Illinois then.
Pardon this interruption, but teachers and students, we would...
So the story about Dred Scott versus Sanford is that Dred Scott is a very important case involving a slave and the question of whether or not he is a slave. So Scott is a slave in Missouri for his whole life, and then in 1833 his master moved to Illinois, which is a free state, and then into an area of the Louisiana Territory where slavery is forbidden by the Missouri Compromise of 1820. There is no slavery in the territories. After coming back to Missouri, Scott sues unsuccessfully in the Missouri courts for his freedom, claiming that his residence in free territory made him a free man. So then Scott brings suit in federal court. And Scott's master, actually his master's wife, maintains that no pure-blooded Negro of African descent and the descendant of slaves could be a citizen in sense of Article 3 of the Constitution. So, is Scott a slave? That's the question before the court, and here's what they decide. So they decide 3 things. Number 1, slaves are property and not citizens, and therefore they cannot bring suit in a court of law. Number 2, it upholds the property rights of Sanford himself by saying that because he had traveled in free states with his master, we cannot deprive Sanford of his property rights because that's not what governments do. He remains a slave. And then number 3, it goes back and even more broadly interprets that Congress does not have the right to outlaw slavery in any territory because it deprives a citizen of their property without due process of law. And we go back to the Enlightenment. That's one of the things our country was founded on. So the Missouri Compromise, which we didn't really cover, but it's still, it's not that big of a deal. It's unconstitutional, at least the part that says that no slaves could be carried into the territories because a man should be able to take his property with him where he goes. So the Southerners are overjoyed with the Scott decision. Northerners are very scared and alarmed by it. And this is sort of the tipping point or the point of no return toward the Civil War, which begins in 1860-61. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. I'm sorry about the title there. But John Brown feels violence is the answer to this problem. And so he and his followers, his sons, seize a military arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is now in West Virginia. And he hopes to inspire local slaves to join his revolt, but no slaves join. He's captured by Colonel Robert E. Lee of the U.S. Army at that point. He's put on trial for treason and murder and hanged to death, but he's a hero to abolitionists everywhere. and it increases the Northern opposition to slavery, but at the same time, the Southerners think that he's a madman, he's crazy, they're now suspicious of Northerners, and they're very, very upset about John Brown's raid. And that's the same John Brown that killed the 5 people in Bleeding, Kansas. So let's talk about the election of 1860, which we get to. There's 4 candidates because the Democrat Party splits in half. The Republican candidate is Abraham Lincoln. In his view on slavery is that slaves must not be allowed in the territories, and he doesn't want to interfere with slavery in its current capacity in the South. He just doesn't want it to spread. The Northern Democrat, who is not against slavery, but not necessarily for it either, he says that popular sovereignty, again, Stephen Douglas, the guy who did the Kansas-Nebraska Act, says that popular sovereignty should decide slavery in the new states, not anything else. John Breckinridge is the Southern Democrat, and he says that the federal government must protect slavery where it's at and expand it into the territories. And then John Bell is a part of the Constitutional Unionist Party, which is some free soilers and some Whigs, and it's kind of made up of everybody. And they take kind of a middle-of-the-road stance and said the federal government should support slavery and we should keep the Union together. So let's take a look at the election of 1860 results. You can see here that Abraham Lincoln takes the North and Oregon and California at this point. Takes those states. The South belongs to John Breckinridge, and then the middle states sort of split over Constitutional Unionists, and Stephen Douglas also only carries Missouri and half of New Jersey. So it's kind of what we notice here is there's a clear divide between Lincoln and Breckinridge. Lincoln wasn't even on most of the southern states' ballots because they didn't want to give up slavery. But now the South is upset, they're scared, they don't want to lose slavery, so they really have to start thinking about, did a president just get elected whose opinions and attitudes are hostile to slavery? And that's what happens. Right after the election and the results are announced, South Carolina calls a convention to secede as soon as Lincoln won. And like I just said, they elected a president whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. 6 other states secede in the next few weeks, and these 7 total states form the new Confederate States of America. The Constitution is very similar to the U.S., but it preserves states' rights in slavery because we talked about a confederation before. It is something that gives most of the power to the states. And here you can see the map of the states that secede. So you've got border states that did not secede. West Virginia also did not secede, but it kind of secedes away from Virginia to become its own state in the middle of the Civil War. The states secede before the fall of Fort Sumter, which is the first battle, are in the South. You can see those string of blue states. Then the next string of gray states secede after the first battle of Fort Sumter. And then those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 states will form the Confederate States of America. And so one last thing is tried to salvage something out of this. The Crittenden Compromise by Kentucky Senator John Crittenden. The goal is to resolve the secession crisis by giving in to these demands made by the southern states in order to keep them from seceding. Will allow slavery in the western territories south of the 3630 line, which is part of the Missouri Compromise. Federal funds, we will reimburse slave holders for slaves that are unreturned to them if they run away. And Congress would not interfere with slavery in the slave states or Washington, D.C., and other last-ditch efforts also failed. This was voted down. It does not become law, and the Civil War is going to begin. That's all I have for you today. Fill out those learning targets, bring any questions back to class, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.